4.Lemuria Atlantis Archipelago Book. Section 4. Santo Saba Works. Created as a discourse to scientists based on academic studies and studies. In an effort to restore the true history of Indonesia. The location of Atlantis. This power came from the Atlantic Ocean. At that time, the Atlantic Ocean was navigable and there was an island in front of the strait which you call the Pillars of Hercules. The island is wider than Libya and Asia combined, and these pillars are also the entrance to the other islands around it, and from them you can reach the entire continent which borders the Atlantic Sea. The sea within the Pillars of Hercules is just like a port with a narrow entrance. But the sea beyond, which is a true sea, and the continents that surround it, can be called a continent without borders. In this area of Atlantis, there was a large empire that ruled the entire island and other islands around it and parts of other continents, Timaeus. The origin of the people of Atlantis. Previously I have talked about the division of the territories held for the gods and how they are scattered throughout the world in different proportions. And Poseidon received his share, namely the island of Atlantis. Critias. In the center of the island there was a plain which was considered the best and had fertile land. There was a mountain that was not very high on either side. On that mountain lived a man named Evenor who had a wife named Lucipe. They have one daughter named Cleito. When Cleito was an adult, his mother and father died. Poseidon falls in love and has sex with him. Critias. The name Cleito, which Plato calls it, is identical to the Chetho building, which has been described above. Characteristics of the land of Atlantis. Poseidon then broke the ground around the hill where Cleito lived so that the hill was separated from other plains. The hill is now surrounded by a circular sea. Poseidon made 2 parts of land like this so that the total is 2 lands surrounded by 3 water areas. Critias. Each land has a circumferent equidistance from the center of the island. So no one person and a single ship can reach the island. Poseidon then made 2 springs in the middle of the island, one warm water and one cold water. He also made all kinds of food emerge from the fertile soil. Critias. Ancestors of the Atlanteans. Poseidon and Cleito had 5 sets of male twins. He then divided the island of Atlantis into 10 parts. He gave the eldest to the first twins the place of their mother's residence and the territory that surrounds it, which is the widest and best land. He also made him king upon his brethren. Poseidon gave the boy the name Atlas. And therefore all the islands and the oceans were called the Atlantic. Critias. Pay attention to 10 figures of people and one person who may be their parents. Prosperity of the Atlanteans. The land of Atlantis is the best land in the world and therefore capable of accommodating large numbers of troops. Critias. The land also benefits from the annual rainfall, has abundant supplies all over the place. Critias. Orichalcum can be excavated in many parts of the island. At that time orichalcum was more valuable than anything of value, except for gold. On the island there was also plenty of wood for carpentry work and a sufficient supply of livestock or wild animals, who live on rivers or land, who live on mountains or plains. Even on that island there are also many elephants. Critias. Structure of the Atlantis society. At that time, the territory of Atlantis was inhabited by various classes of society. There were masons, carpenters, husbands and soldiers. For the soldiers, they got their own territory and all the necessities for life and education were provided in abundance. They were never considered that what they had was their own. They considered it a common possession. They also never demanded more food than was needed. Critias. These soldiers lived in the vicinity of the temples of Athena and Hephaestus at the top of the hill. In that place they then made a fence to protect the place. In the north, they built a room for eating in winter and made buildings that could be used for common needs. Critias. They don't worship gold and silver because for them, all that is useless. They also build simple houses where their children can grow. Critias. This is their way of life. They are the custodians of their own people and the leaders of all the Hellenists who voluntarily follow them. Then they also keep an equal number of women and men in case of war. In this way they administered their territory and the entire Hellas region fairly. Atlantis became very famous throughout Europe and Asia because of the good looks and kindness of its inhabitants. Critias. Atlantis technology. They built temples, palaces and harbors. They also governed the whole territory in the following order. First they built a bridge to connect the area of water with land surrounding the ancient city. Then make your way to and from the palace. They built palaces on the residences of the gods and their ancestors, which the next generation continued to care for. Each king passed his extraordinary abilities to the next king until they were able to construct buildings that were extraordinarily large and beautiful. Critias. And they built a canal 300 feet wide with a depth of 100 feet and a length of 50 stadia, 9 kilometers. They also made an inlet large enough for even the largest ships to pass through, and through this canal they can sail towards the outer zone. Critias. Destruction of the island of Atlantis. 9,000 years is the number of years that have passed since the war that took place between those who dwelt outside the Pillars of Hercules and those who dwelt in them. It is this war one shall describe. Critias. One army was led by the cities of Athens. On the other hand, the troops were led directly by the kings of Atlantis, that is, as I have explained, an island larger than Libya and Asia combined, which was then destroyed by an earthquake, and become a pile of mud that becomes a barrier for explorers sailing to other parts of the ocean. Critias. Many floods have occurred during the 9,000 years, that is, the number of years that have occurred as I speak. And during that time there have also been many changes. Never in history has so much accumulated land fallen from the mountains in one region, has fallen and buried the area of Atlantis and covered it from sight. Critias. Because only overnight, extremely heavy rains swept across the earth, and at the same time an earthquake occurred. Then there was a flood that inundated the whole region. Critias. But after that, there appeared a terrible earthquake and flood. And in one day and one night, all the inhabitants sank into the bowels of the earth, and the island of Atlantis disappeared into the great ocean. And for this reason, parts of the ocean there became impassable and unexplored, because there is a pile of mud caused by the destruction of the island. Timaeus. Zeus, the king of the gods who ruled according to the law and was able to see the evil deeds they were doing, began to punish that honorable race so that they could be awakened and purified. Then he began to gather the gods from their respective residences. All gathered, Zeus said, Critias. And with that sentence Critias ended, unfinished. Dialogue. Critias, Hermocrates, Timaeus, Socrates. This is a snippet of dialogue in Plato's book in translated Greek text. Let me start by observing first of all, that 9,000 is the number of years that have passed since the war which is said to have occurred between those who live outside the Pillars of Heracles. This war one will explain. From other powers on the one hand, the city of Athens is reported to have had a leader and had fought its way out of the war. The territory on the other hand was commanded by the kings of Atlantis, which was the larger island on the boundary of Libya and Asia, and when it was submerged afterwards by an earthquake, became a passable barrier of mud to sailors sailing from here to every part of the sea. That historical progress will reveal the various barbarian nations and families of Hellenes that later existed, as they successively appeared on the scene. But I must first describe the Athena of that day, and their enemies who fought with them, and then the respective powers and governments of the two kingdoms. Let us give priority to Athens. In the old days the gods have spread the whole earth between them by rationing. There is no fighting, for you cannot properly suppose that the gods do not know what is right for each of them to have, or, knowing this, that they will seek to obtain for themselves on the presumption that the better belongs to someone else. All of them they obtained by sharing only what they wanted in their own place and property, as shepherds of their flocks. Hephaestus and Athena, who were brothers and sisters, from the same father, had a common character, and were united also in the love of philosophy and art, both acquired as their common share of this land, naturally adapted for wisdom and virtue. And there they are trained as brave and clever children to rule their territory or the people who live in the mountains. And they do not know the art of writing, and hear only the names of the leaders of the country, but very little about their actions. Regarding the country, the Egyptian priests said what was not only possible but evidently true, that the boundaries which were in the days established by the isthmus, and which were to their continents extended as far as the heights of Cithaeron and Parnes. The line descends in the direction of the sea, has the district of Oropus on the right, and with the river Asopus as the boundary on the left. The land is the best in the world, and therefore it can be in those days to support a great army, raised from the surrounding people. Even the present-day remains of Attica can compare with regions of the world for the variety and superiority of fruits and pastures for each animal breed, which proves what I am saying. The whole country is just a long headland stretching far out to sea away from the rest of the continent, while the basins surrounding the ocean are everywhere deep in the coastal environment. Many great deluges have occurred over the course of 9,000 years, for which number of years have passed since the time of which I speak. And during all this time and through so many changes, there was once a sufficient accumulation of land descending from the mountains, as elsewhere, but disaster submerged the land. The consequence is, as in the case of small islands, all the richer and softer parts of the land have high mountains, the hills are covered with soil, and the plains, as we call it, of Phelleus are full of rich earth, and there is an abundance of wood in the mountains. From this last trail still remains, for although some of the mountains are now of wood cut from the trees growing there, which are of a size sufficient to cover the largest of houses, and there are many other tall trees, cultivated by humans and much forage for livestock. In addition, the land reaps the benefits of annual rainfall, water that flows from the land to the sea. However, it has abundant supply all over the place, and accepts to be itself and cherish it, and it is in the near clay, releasing into the basins from which rivers are absorbed. From a height, providing everywhere abundant fountains and rivers, from which there can still be observed sacred memories of places where fountains once existed, and this proves the truth of what I said. Such is the natural state of the country, which is cultivated, as we may believe, is true, that makes their farms and lovers of honor, and of noble nature, and has the best land in the world, and the abundance of water, and in the sky above the climate is very good. Now the city in the days is set on this wise. But the fact is that the one night disaster occurred heavy rain and floods, at the same time there was an earthquake, and then there was a tremendous inundation, which was the third before the great destruction of Deucalion. But in primitive times the hills of the Acropolis extended to Eridanus and Ilissus, and included Pnyx on the one hand, and Lycabettus's borders on the opposite side to Pnyx, and all were well covered with ground, and levels above, except in one or two places. Beyond the Acropolis and down the hillside there are artisans living, tilling the land close by. The night class silenced itself around the temples of Athena and Hephaestus at the top. Moreover, they had been enclosed by a single fence like the garden of a single house. On the north side they had the same dwellings and had erected a room for eating in winter, and had all the buildings they needed to live with them, apart from a temple, but nothing was decorated with gold and silver, for they were made of no use. This is for every purpose. They take a middle path between ugliness and pride, and build simple houses in which they and their children grow up, and they leave them to others who, like themselves, are always the same. But in the summer they left their gardens and played and ate in the hall, and then the south side of the hill was used by them for the same purpose. Where the Acropolis is there is a fountain, which has been destroyed by the earthquake, and has left only a few small rivers still around it, but in those days the fountains provided an abundant supply of water for all and a suitable temperature in summer and in winter. This is how they lived, became themselves citizens and leaders of the Hellenes, who were willing to become their followers. And they take care to preserve the same number of men and women through all time, which is so much as necessary for warlike purposes, then as it is now. That is to say, about 20,000. As the ancient Athenians, and after this way they should be given their own land and the rest of Hellas. They were famous all over Europe and Asia for the beauty of the people and for the much virtue of their souls, and all those who lived their days were the most famous. And furthermore, if I have not forgotten what I heard when I was a child, I will give you the character and origin of their enemies. For friends do not have to keep their story to themselves, but have them in common. Before going any further in the story, however, I must warn you, that you should not be surprised if you may have heard the Hellenic name given to foreigners. I will tell you the reason for this. Solon, intending to use the story for his poetry, inquired into the meanings of the names, and found that early Egyptian writing them had been translated into their own language, and the meanings of some of the names and when copying them out again translated into our language. My great-grandfather, Dropides, had the original writing, which I still have, and was carefully studied by me when I was a child. Hence if you hear names like this one used, you shouldn't be surprised, because I told you how they were introduced. The story, which is of great length, begins as follows. I have previously commented in speaking of the gods, that they divided the whole earth into different parts and made for themselves temples and sacrifices. And Poseidon, received the island of Atlantis, begat children by a woman, and put them in a part of the island, which I will describe. Looking towards the sea, but at the center of the entire island, there was a plain which was said to have been the most fertile of all the plains and very fertile. Near the plain again, and also in the center of the island at a distance of about 50 stadia, there were not very high mountains on each side. On this mountain there lived one earth-born a man who was descended from an earlier civilization, named Evanor, and he had a wife named Lucipe, and they had only a child called Cleto, a girl who had reached adulthood when her father and mother died. Poseidon fell in love with him and formed a household in which he lived and created alternative zones of sea and land larger and smaller, surrounding each other. There are 2 lands and 3 waters, which are circular in shape, each having a circumference equidistant from the center. He himself, being the leader, found no difficulty in making special arrangements for the island, managing and developing 2 springs from beneath the earth, one warm water and the other cold, and making every variety of food spring abundantly from the ground. He also gave birth to 5 sets of twin boys, and dividing the island of Atlantis into 10 parts, he gave to the eldest son of the eldest to install his mother's dwelling and the rationing around it, the greatest and the best, and make him king over the rest. In others he made princes, and gave them dominion over many men, and great territories. The oldest, who was the first king, he was named Atlas, and after him the whole island and sea was called the Atlantic. For his twin brother, who was born after him, and obtained as much of it from the tip of the island to the pillars of Heracles, facing the country now called the region of Gades in that part of the world, he gave his name which in Greek is Eumelis, in the language of the country that is named after him, Gadeirus. From the pair of twins he called one Amphirs, and the other Evimen. For the older of the third pair of twins he gave the name Menasius, and the native to those who followed him. Of the fourth pair of twins he was called the elder Elasippus, and the younger Mestor. And of the fifth pair he gave to the elder the name Azes, and to the younger one from Diaprepes. All these and their descendants for many generations were the inhabitants and masters of the island diving of the open sea, and also, as has already been said, they held power over us all the lands in the pillars as far as Egypt and Tyrrhenia. Now that Atlas had many and honorable families, and they were in the kingdom, the eldest son handed him over to the eldest for many generations, and they possessed such an amount of wealth as never before had by kings and rulers, and may never happen again, and they were equipped with everything they needed, both in city and country. For the greatness of their kingdom many things were brought to them from foreign countries, and the island itself provided most of what was needed by them for the use of life. In the first place, they excavated from the earth whatever was to be found there orichalcum, dug out of the earth in many parts of the island, which was more valuable in the days than anything but gold. Also whatever fragrant thing there is now on the earth, whether roots, or grass, or forest, or essence that sifts from fruit and flowers, grows and develops in the land, also the confessing fruit of cultivation. Both the dry kind, which is given to us for food, and the fruits have a hard skin, their water is for drinking and meat and stores much oil if they are to give pleasure and amusement, and the fruits which indulge with keeping, and the kind of delightful dessert, which we entertain ourselves after supper, when we are tired of eating all this, that the holy island then sees the sunshine, brings forth justice and amazing and in infinite abundance. With blessings as the earth freely furnished them, meanwhile they continued building their temples and palaces and harbors and docks. And they governed the whole country in the following way. First they bridged over the sea zone that surrounded the ancient metropolis, making their way to and from the royal palace. And in the beginning they built palaces in the abode of the gods and their ancestors, whom they continued to make ornaments through the generations, each king making buildings which were magnificent to behold for size and for beauty. And starting from their sea a canal of 300 feet wide and 100 feet deep and 50 stadia long, which they carried through to the outermost zone, creating a part of the sea up to this, which became a harbor, and left an opening sufficient to activate largest ship to find the entry. In addition, they were divided on the bridge by land zones which bisected the sea zone, leaving room for one trireme to enter from one zone to another, and they were covered in channels, thus leaving way below for ships, for areas far above the water. Now the largest of the zones where a part is cut from the sea is 3 stages in breadth, and the land zone which comes next is equal in size, but the next 2 zones, one water, the other land, 2 stadia, and the one that surrounded the central island is the stadium only wide. The island where the palace is located has a diameter of 5 stadia. All this includes the zone and the bridge, which is the 6th part of the wide stadium. They are surrounded by stone walls on each side, placing towers and gates on the bridge where the sea is legalized on. The stones used in their work are excavated from under the central island, and from below the zone, both outside and inside. One of a kind was white, the other was black, and the third was red, and as they were excavated, they were at the same time concave double piers, having formed the roof of the original stone. Some of their buildings are simple, but in others they put different, varied colors together for stones. Pleasing to the eye, and being a natural source of fun. The whole area of the wall, which went around the outer zone, they covered with layers of brass, and their next wall was covered with lead, and the third, which covered the fort, flashed with red light orichalcum. The palace on the inside of the fort was built on this wise. In the center is a holy temple dedicated to Cleito and Poseidon, which remains inaccessible, and is surrounded by a golden fence. This is the place where the family of 10 princes first saw the light, and there the people annually brought the fruits of the earth in their seasons of all 10 parts, becoming an offering for 10 each. Here is the temple of Poseidon itself, which is a long stadium, and a half-wide stadium, and of a proportional height, has a strange appearance. All outside the temple, with the exception of the top, they were covered with silver, and the crest with gold. In the interior of the temple the roof was of ivory, oddly beaten everywhere in gold and silver and orichalcum, and all the other parts, walls and pillars and floors, they were covered with orichalcum. In their temple a golden statue was placed. There was the god himself standing on a charioteer of 6 horses and with wings such that he touched the roof of the building with his head. Around him there were 100 nereids riding on the dolphins, for that was supposed to be the number of several bodyguards. There are also other images in the temple interiors which have been dedicated by private persons. And around the temple outside were placed golden statues of all the descendants of the 10 kings and them wives, and there were many other great offerings from kings and private men, coming both from the city itself and from outside the cities in which they held power. There is an altar too, which in size and workmanship corresponds to this splendor, and the palace, in such a way, responds to the majesty of the kingdom and the glory of the temple. In the next place, they had fountains, one cold and another hot, in which many hearts flowed, and they are wonderfully adapted for use for reasons of enjoyment. And their water's superiority. They built buildings about them and planted suitable trees, also they made wells, some open to the sky, others with more roofs, for use in winter as a warm bath. Some were the king's baths, and the baths of private persons, which were kept separate, and there were separate baths for women, and for horses and cattle, and for each they gave as much jewelry as much. From the flowing waters they brought some to the grove of Poseidon, where grew all kinds of tall trees of beauty, because of the superiority of the land, while the rest was thus conveyed the aqueducts along the bridge to the outer ring. And there are many temples built and dedicated to many gods. Also gardens and training grounds, some for men, and others for horses on the 2 islands formed by the zone. And in the center of the greater of the 2 there was established a separate race course stadium wide, and the length allowed to extend along the island, for horses to race. There are also soldier escorts for guards, more trusted than those appointed to stand guard in the lower zone, which are nearer the Acropolis, while the most trusted of all have their homes give them in the fort, near those of the kings. The dock is full of soldiers and naval troops, and everything is pretty ready to use. Enough of the king's palace plan. These are the ubiquitous 50 stadia from the largest zone or harbor, the whole, the ends meet at the mouth of the channel leading to the sea. The entire area was crowded with places to live, and the canals and the greatest of the harbors were full of ships and merchants who came from all parts, who, from their number, kept rising the multifarious voices of men, and the din and clinks of all kinds of the night. I have described the city and its surroundings from the ancient palace almost in the words of Solon, and now I must endeavor to represent the nature and makeup of the remaining land. The whole country, which was said to be very high and steep on the side of the sea, but the country immediately about and surrounded the city was plain of level, itself surrounded by mountains that descended towards the sea. It is smooth and even, and form rectangular, extending in one direction 3,000 stadia, but across from the center of the interior was 2,000 stadia. This part of the island looked towards the south, and was protected from the north. The surrounding mountains are celebrated for their number and size and beauty, far beyond what is still there, for in them are also many rich villages of the country's people, and rivers, and lakes, and meadows supply sufficient food for every animal, wild or tame, and there are many kinds of wood, abundant for every kind of work. I will now describe the plains, as shaped by nature and by the laborers of many generations of kings through a long life. I is for the most part rectangular and oblong, and where falling from a straight line follows a circular trench. The depth, and width, and length of this trench is extraordinary, and gives the impression that a work in such a way, apart from many others, could never have been artificial. Nevertheless, I have to say what I was told. Once dug to a depth of 100 feet, and width were stadiums everywhere, it was carried out along the entire plain, and was 10,000 stadia in length. It receives a stream that descends from the mountain, and winding its way round the plain and meeting in the city, is there releasing into the sea. Farther inland, too, a straight canal 100 feet wide was cut from through the plains, and again let go into a ditch leading to the sea. These canals were at intervals of 100 stadia, and by them they were brought down the logs from the mountains to the city, and conveyed fruit from the earth on the ship, cutting the cross section from one canal to another, and to the city. Twice in the year they collect fruit from the earth. In winter it has the benefit of rain from the sky, and in summer the water that is land is provided by introducing streams from the canals. For the population, each of the lots on the plains had to find a leader for people suitable for military service, and the size of the lot was 10 stadium squares each way, and the total number of all lots was 60,000. And from the inhabitants of the mountains and from all over the land there were also vast multitudes, which were distributed among the many and had leaders assigned to them according to their districts and villages. The leader needed to equip for the war the sixth part of the war chariot, thus making a total of 10,000 chariots, also 2 horses and a rider for them, and a pair of chariots without seats, accompanied by a rider who could fight on foot carrying a small shield, and had a charioteer who stood behind the man in arms to guide 2 horses. Also, he was bound to provide 2 heavily armed soldiers, 2 slingers, 3 rock gunners and 3 javelins, who were lightly armed, and 4 sailors to make up the complement of 1,200 ships. That's how the military orders of the other 9 order city kingdoms varied, and it would be tiring to tell some of their differences. For office and honor, here is a list of the first. Each of the 10 kings in his own division and within his own city had absolute control of the citizens, and, in most cases, punished and whoever killed him would. Now the order of priority between them and their mutual relations was governed by an order from Poseidon whose law had been passed. These were inscribed by the first kings on the pillar of orichalcum, which was located in the center of the island, at the temple of Poseidon, to which the kings gathered every 5th and every 6th year in turn, thus giving the same honor with odd and even numbers. And when they gather together they consult about their common interests, and ask if anyone has transgressed in anything and passed judgment, and before they pass judgment they give their promises to each other like the following. There are bulls who have various the temple of Poseidon. And 10 kings, who were left alone in the temple, after they had offered a prayer to the Lord that they might catch the sacrifice which he accepted, the bulls hunted, without weapons but with rods and nooses, and the bull which they caught them aimed at the pole and cut its throat from above so that the blood fell on the holy inscription. Now on the pillars, apart from statutes, are written oaths invoking the mighty curse of obedience. When therefore, after slaughtering the bulls in an accustomed way, having their limbs burnt, they filled a bowl of wine and cast it in. Blood for each. The rest of their victims were put in the fire, after being purified the all-round column. Then they drew from the bowl in the golden cup and poured offerings on the fire, swearing that they would judge according to the statute concerning pillars, and would punish him who at every point had transgressed them, and that for their future they would not, whether they could help, offend against those who wrote on the pillars, and would not order anyone else, or obey any ruler who ordered them, to act other than according to the laws of their father Poseidon. It is a prayer that each of them is offered for himself and for his descendants, at the same time drinking and dedicating the chalice from which he drank in the temple of the god. They were fulfilled, when darkness came, and the fire of that sacrifice, they all wore the most beautiful blue robes, and, sitting on the ground, at night, over the embers of sacrifice which they had ordained, and extinguished all the flames of the temple, they accept and give judgment, if one of them should bring accusations against one. And when they were given judgment, at dawn they wrote their sentences on gold tablets, and dedicated it, together with their robes, to serve as a memorial. There are many special laws affecting several kings written about the temples, but the most important ones are the following. They do not take up arms against one another, and they all come to the rescue if one in each of their cities tries to overthrow the house royal. Like their ancestors, they were to talk publicly about war and other things, giving supremacy to the descendants of Atlas. And the king does not have the power of life and death over any of his kinsmen unless he has the consent of most of the 10. Such was the great power that the gods settled on the lost island of Atlantis, and this he was then directed against our land for the following reasons, as tradition says. For many generations, as long as the divine nature prevailed in them, they obeyed the law, and were well affectioned towards the God, who was their seed, because they have true and in all things great spirit, unites tenderness with wisdom in the various occasions of life, and their relationships with one another. They hated everything but virtue, cared little for the country they now live in, and thought lightly of the possession of gold and other property, which seemed only a burden to them. Not that they drunk luxury, nor does wealth keep them from self-control, but they are drunk, and see clearly that all these things increase in benevolence and friendship with one another, whereas with too great a thing in respect for them, they are lost in their friendship with them. By such reflection and by their divine continuity within them, the qualities which we have described grow and increase among them. But when the divine part begins to fade, and becomes diluted too often and too much with mortal mixtures, and human nature has the upper hand, they then, unable to bear their fate, behave appropriately, and everyone who has eyes to see grows up looking despicable, for them to lose the fairest of valuable gifts. But to those who have no eyes to see true happiness, they appear glorious and blessed at the very time when they are full of greed and unrighteous electricity. Zeus, the god of gods, who rules according to law, and is able to see into such things, observes that the honorable race is in a miserable state, and wants to cause punishment upon them, that they might be flogged and increase, gathering all the gods into their most holy abode, who, being placed at the center of the world, beholds everything that is created. And when he summoned them together, he spoke as follows: the rest of the Critias dialogue had disappeared. Records of the current Atlantis era. These include the eruption of Mount Meru in South India and Mount Sumeru, Mahameru in East Java. Then the volcanic eruption in Sumatra which formed Lake Toba with the island of Somasir, which was the peak of the mountain that erupted at that time. The most devastating eruption later on was Mount Krakatoa, which was dividing parts of Sumatra and Java and others and forming the Strait of the Sunda Plain. Atlantis comes from the Sanskrit language Atala, which means heaven or watch tower, Atalaya Portuguese, Atalaya, Spain. Plato emphasized that the Atlantis region at that time was the center of world civilization in the form of culture, natural resources, science, technology, and others. Plato determined that the location of Atlantis was in the Atlantic Ocean today. In his time, he maintained that the Earth was flat and surrounded by one ocean, as a whole. Ocean comes from the Sanskrit word ashayana, which means to surround as a whole. This opinion was later opposed by later experts such as Copernicus, Galileo, Einstein, and Stephen Hawking. Santos differs from Plato regarding the location of Atlantis. The Brazilian scientist argued that at the time of the eruption of various volcanoes, the ice sheet melted and flowed into the ocean so that its area increased. The water and mud from these volcanic ash burdens the oceans and their bottoms, causing tremendous pressure on the Earth's crust on the ocean floor, especially on the coasts of continents. This pressure caused an earthquake. This earthquake was strengthened again by mountains that erupted later in succession and caused a powerful tsunami wave. Santos named it Heinrich events. In an attempt to express an opinion based on world history, it appears that Plato has made two mistakes. First, regarding the shape, position of the Earth, which is said to be flat. Second, regarding the location of the continent of Atlantis, which is said to be in the Atlantic Ocean, which is opposed by Santos. United States military research in the Atlantic region has proven unsuccessful in finding traces of the lost continent. Therefore, it is not arbitrary that there is a proverb that says, Amicus Plato, sed magical amica veritas. That means, I am happy with Plato but I prefer the truth. However, there are some present circumstances between which Plato and Santos agree. Namely, first, that the location of the submerged continent was Atlantis, and by Santos it was confirmed as the territory of the Republic of Indonesia. Second, the number or length of the volcanic chain in Indonesia. Among them are Karen Sea, Talong, Krakatoa, Malabar, Galunggung, Pangrango, Merapi, Merbabu, Semeru, Bromo, Agung, Rinjani. Some of the mountains have been or are being active again. Third, about the mudflow due to volcanic eruptions whose ash is mixed with seawater into mud. This silt in the sea then seeps into the land on land. This hot mud is mixed with natural gases, which is an impossible barrier of mud, or innavigable, which cannot be penetrated or entered. In the case in Sidoarjo, remote sensing was carried out, which indicated that there was a canalization system in the area. It is possible that the canalization was a former channel of hot mudflow from the past. That Indonesia is a region that is considered the heir of Atlantis, of course, should make us grateful. Makes us not inferior in international relations, because Atlantis at its time was the center of world civilization. Archaeological evidence. 1. One day in 1968, the Bimini Islands around the Atlantic Ocean in the Bahamas Island cluster, the sea is calm and clear like bright glass, translucent to the bottom of the sea. Several divers were on their way back to the Bimini Islands. Suddenly someone screamed in surprise. On the seabed there is a big road. Several divers simultaneously plunge down. It turns out that there is indeed a big road stretching out made of giant stones. It is a large road built using rectangular and polygon stones. The size of the stones and thickness are not the same, but the arrangement is very neat. The contours are brilliant. Is this the way of the post of the Kingdom of Atlantis? 2. Early 1970s, a group of researchers have arrived in the vicinity of the islands of Yasuil, Atlantic Ocean. They've taken the cores by drilling at a depth of 800 meters on the ocean floor, scientifically speaking, where it really is. A landmass 12,000 years ago. The conclusions drawn on the basis of scientific technology are just as much like those described by Plato. However, is here the sinking of the Kingdom of Atlantis? 3. In 1974, a USSR Marine observer ship made 8 pieces of photos which, when extracted, form an ancient human masterpiece. Was this built by the Atlanteans? 4. In 1979, American and French scientists with very sophisticated instruments found the pyramid on the seabed, Triangle of Death, Bermuda Sea. The pyramid is approximately 300 meters long, 200 meters high. The top of the pyramid with the ocean surface is only 100 meters away, bigger than the Egyptian pyramids. The bottom of the pyramid there are 2 giant holes, seawater with amazing speed flows at the bottom of the hole. This great pyramid, was it built by the people of Atlantis? Atlan's royal troops conquered Egypt. Did the Atlanteans bring pyramid civilization to Egypt? The American continent also has a pyramid. Did it come from Egypt or did it come from the Kingdom of Atlantis? 5. In 1985, 2 Norwegian sailors discovered an ancient city under the sea area, Triangle of Death. In the photos the 2 of them took, there were plains, vertical and horizontal roads and passageways, domed roofed houses, fighting arena, animals, temples, riverbanks, etc. They both said, absolute belief, what we found was the Atlantic continent, exactly as described by Plato. Is that true? Unfortunately, the seafloor pyramid of the Bermuda Triangle was successfully investigated from above sea level using sophisticated instruments. Until now, no scientist has been able to confirm whether a building was actually built by human power, because it might be an underwater mountain peak, pyramid-shaped. Photographs of the remains of ancient buildings on the seabed taken by the Russian expedition team also cannot prove there is the former site of the Kingdom of Atlantis. After that, there is the expedition team diving to the bottom. Ocean stone roads on the Atlantic Ocean floor of Bimini Island, taking samples of rock roads, and carried out laboratory research and analysis. The results show that this stone path has not reached its age. 10.00 years. If this path was made by the Kingdom of Atlantis, it would have been at least 10,000 years. Regarding the photos shown by the two Norwegian sailors, there is nothing to prove until now. The only correct conclusion that can be drawn is that there is a sunken landmass on the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean. If it is true that over the Atlantic Sea there was once the Kingdom of Atlantis, and the Kingdom of Atlantis really sank to the bottom of the Atlantic Sea, then the traces of the Atlantic Sea floor can certainly be found. Until recently, the Kingdom of Atlantis remained a mystery throughout the ages. And it is true, from what I saw on the bottom of the shallow waters of the Caribbean found a kind of very long path with a very modern structure. In addition, the waters were also found in some kind of traces of buildings that had been destroyed. Is it true that the continent of Atlantis never existed before? Hundreds of thousands of years ago, when the Aryan race left their land of origin on the shores of the Asian seas, developed into the new lands of Europe until it reached the advancement of ancient Greece and Rome. In the past, the first sub-Aryans in prehistoric times inhabited India and the colonies of Egypt, namely the second sub-race became the Babylonians and Assyrians based in the hieroglyphic manuscripts found in the tombs of ancient Egypt. The third Aryan sub-race is Persian Iran, the fourth sub-race is the Celtic civilization that preceded the Greek and Roman civilizations. There is a void of the sub-race period, namely the fifth root sub-race. While the sixth and seventh roots develop and spread in the continents of North and South America. The Atlantean race is in the fourth sub-root and has developed into many nations. The great disaster that occurred in the civilization of Atlantis occurred four catastrophic events, namely 1. Miocene era 800,000 years ago. 2. The era of 200,000 years ago. 3. Era 80,000 years ago. This disaster destroyed the civilization of Atlantis, leaving the island of Poseidon's Plato's version. 4. Era year 9564 BC, drowning Poseidon's island. Scientific evidence about the existence of the continent of Atlantis, namely 1. The discovery of a shallow and even seabed due to the sinking of the land. 2. Distribution of flora and fauna which is known from the similarity of its species. 3. There are similarities in language and ethnological types. 4. There are similarities in beliefs and similarities in ritual practices and similarities in architectural forms of buildings. 5. Found basic similarities in ancient records, cultural traditions and cultural legends, especially the story of the Great Flood. Professor Asa Gray, a botanist and zoology expert, stated that of the 66 genres and 155 species found in the eastern forests of the Rocky Mountains, only 31 genres and 78 species were found which are genres and species native to the area. This proves that there are some animals and plants that come from other areas. It is also evidence that this area was once united in one large land area and was not bounded by oceans. A German botanist, Professor Kuntz, argues that the banana plant is not native to America. Bananas are native to tropical climates around the equator, namely Asia and Africa. This proves that the previous civilizations that brought this tree to America. Professor Wallace, who in many studies, especially on island life, explained the special characteristics of flora and fauna on each island which is bounded by the sea, concluded that in an area has special characteristics that are not owned by other islands if indeed the island never merges, or confined by the sea since its past. This can be observed in the flora of wheat. Wheat is a variety that comes from outside of Europe. Wheat fossils have been found in Europe in the Stone Age, which were found in the wheat fossils in the lake after research. These fossils are the same as wheat in the Stone Age. Egypt. There is even an assumption that wheat is also not native to the earth as well as bees. Bees, both types of animals and plants, originate from other planets, namely Venus. Wheat and bees that have existed since the time of Lemuria, namely the time before the existence of the civilization of Atlantis. According to the Ferrar linguist, Basque is a language that is still native and is not influenced by other languages. This language is in the western corner of Europe. No using the alphabet language, phonetic, which is characterized by the sign or form of the sound. Starting with the Chippeway legend, and following with the Bible and Phoenician records, we create a table like the one attached. Invention. Period. Civilization. Inventor. Fire. Atlantis. Foss, fur, and flocks. Bow and arrow. Chipaway. Manabashu. Use of stones. Chipaway. Manabashu. Use of copper. Chipaway. Manabashu. Brick manufacturing. Atlantis. Indigenous people and Technites. Farming and hunting. Atlantis. Argos and Agrotes. Village life, and raising livestock. Atlantis. Aminos and Magos. Use of salt. Atlantis. Miser and Siddiq. Use of letters. Atlantis. Tatos, or tents. Navigation. Atlantis. The Kabiri, or Koribants. Music art. The Hebrew. Crowd around. Metallurgy, and the use of iron. The Hebrew. Tubal cloth. Syrinx. Greece. Pan. Lute. Greece. Hermes. Iberia was part of the colony of Atlantis, an Iberian race inhabiting the entire Spanish peninsula, from the Mediterranean to the Pyrenees. They were also as far south as Gaul as the Rhone. It is thought that the Iberians of Atlantis and parts of northwest Africa, says Winchell, settled in southwest Europe in the early period from Egypt in northeastern Africa. Spread into Iberia, Spain, Gaul, and the British Isles with an estimated date of 4000 or 5000 BC. As the 4th dynasty, the Egyptians, according to Brugish, around 3500 BC. By then the Iberians had become strong enough to attempt the conquest of the known world. Predamites, p.443. Quote, Diodora's Libyan Amazons, who say, Libyans of the Iberian race, identified with Libyans with brown and grizzly skin, among whom Brugish has shown thought representations on Egyptian monuments from the 4th dynasty. Ibid. Iberians, known as Sicanes, colonized Sicily in ancient times. They were the original settlers in Italy and Sardinia. They were dark-haired in Norway and Sweden. Baudican claims that the Iberians were among its Ligurians, Cantabrians, Asturians, and the Aquitanians. Strabo says, speaking of the Turduli and Turdetani, they were the most advanced and developed of all the tribes of Iberia. They employed the art of writing, and had the best literary books p. 388 from ancient times, and also poetry and laws arranged in verse, which they claim to have existed from 6,000 years ago. Strabo. Lib. E. p. 139. Iberia is represented by the Basque days. Basques are medium size, compact in build, strong and agile, of skin darker than the Spaniards, with gray eyes and black hair. They are simple but proud, patient, cheerful, and friendly. Beautiful women, skilled in men's work, and are extraordinary for their agility and grace. Basques much attached to dancing, and very fond of bagpipe music. New American Encyclopedia, Basque Art. According to Paul Broca, their language stands alone, or has only an analogy with the American type. Of all Europe, we must temporarily hold the Basques to be the oldest inhabitants of our era of the world. Peschel, Races of Men, page 501. The Basque language, its Euskara, shares some features common to Magyars, Osmanli, and other dialects of the Altai family, such as, for example, with Finnish in the Old Continent, as well as Algonquin Lenape and some others in America. New American Encyclopedia, Basque Art. In 1997, a 5th mtDNA haplogroup was identified in Native Americans. This group, called X, is present in 3% of Native Americans. Haplogroup X is not found in Asia, but only found in Europe and the Middle East, especially in some areas in Spain, Bulgaria, Finland, Italy, and Israel. Archaeologists and geneticists believe that the presence of an X in America was not the result of historic crossbreeding. It comes from ancient times. In addition, type X has now been found in ancient Basque remains. Among Native American tribes, the haplog group X has been found in small numbers in the Yakima, Sioux, and Navajo tribes. Greater levels have been found in the Ojibwe, Oneota, and Nuu-chah-Nulth tribes. Haplogroup X has also been found in ancient places in Illinois near Ohio and several other areas near the Great Lakes. Not found so far in South America or Central America including Maya, modern. The haplogroup X appears to have entered America in limited numbers, perhaps from 34,000 BC around 12,000 BC to 10,000 BC, the numbers are much larger. It is important to note that not all Native American tribes have been categorized by mtDNA analysis and that relatively few ancient remains have been tested. The American continent was early and many different racial groups came. Several different waves of migration may occur. The initial wave appears to have occurred around 35,000 BC, around the same time that the Cro-Magnon type appeared in Western Europe. The type 10 in ancient America appears to be related to the Iroquois. This tribe, of course, according to Casey, is partly the remnant of the people who survived the destruction of Atlantis in 10,000 BC. The findings of Group X in the north, the Gobi Alteranans, are cited as evidence that all American migration originated from Siberia via the Bering Strait, but this seems unlikely. With the type 10 present in the Middle East, Europe, ancient Basque, and America, migration from the Gobi to all of these areas is doubtful. The haplog group B, which is only found in aboriginal groups in Southeast Asia, China, Japan, Melanesia, and Polynesia, can represent thy people. Both Chinese and Japanese archaeologists took the idea of Mu seriously, and haplogroup B's findings fit very well with Casey's story about the continent. Most of the Mu people who escaped destruction in 50,000 BC fled to China, India, and Japan. Sometime later, the descendants of these people could have traveled to America. While Casey said that some of the people from Mu entered America, he did not indicate the time period when most came. We only know that after 50,000 BC and before 28,000 BC. Casey points out that the greatest migration from Atlantis took place just before 1000 BC. Many of these Atlantean survivors went to the northeastern coast of America and Canada to become the Iroquois. The Atlantis who moved to America joined the people who were already in America at that time. Atlantis became the leader of the tribes and had serious strife among themselves, which was reflected in the ongoing violent conflict. This is confirmed by the ancient history of the Iroquois, which tells of constant battles which resulted in the displacement of entire tribes that were far away to ensure their survival. Perhaps the most surprising confirmation of Casey's story about ancient America is the existence of haplogroup X. What is known is that haplogroup X first appeared in America probably 34,000 years ago, but its main entry occurred in 1000 WSO BC. This date corresponds to the Casey timeframe for the migration of Atlantis and also the occurrence of X in a particular tribe predicted by his statement. Atlantean gardens, Group 10 also appear to have appeared in ancient Iberia and in the Basque around the same time as in Gobi. These dates correspond to Casey's account of the last two destruction, Atlantis and the migration that resulted. This is also found in Central America, namely the Maya. In this case, Le Plongeon, a person who has studied Maya culture, concludes that 1/3 of the virtual dialect developed in the original Greek dialect, Homer's dialect and Sanskrit dialect. The signs of Egyptian hieroglyphs also come from the Atlantean civilization, meaning that we can conclude that ancient Egypt was the earliest colony of the Atlantean civilization. Namely a branch of the ancient Mayan race in America. The information above tells us that the similarity of language in the ALEC certainly underlies the conclusion that the ancestors of these people previously lived in the same land or continent that has not been separated by the ocean as it is today, named the continent of Lemuria. Continues to Part 5. By Santo Saba.